Quentin Beck was born in Riverside, California. He dreamed of becoming famous in Hollywood and learned all about special effects. Getting a job as a stuntman before designing special effects himself, he became one of the most successful special effects artists in the industry. However, outside of Hollywood, he was seldom recognized, and wanting to become famous, he decided to pursue acting. Unlike his work behind the scenes, Quentin was not a talented performer on camera, and he lacked the patience to become a director. Unable to break into either field, Quentin became frustrated and considered his career to have reached a dead end. A friend of his jokingly suggested that the easiest way to fame was to take down one of the costume superheroes, and Beck realized his special effects and illusions would make him an excellent supervillain. Quentin gathered the needed resources and spent months preparing to take down his target, a new and at the time relatively inexperienced hero known as Spider-Man. Creating his own costume, Quentin dubbed himself Mysterio and attacked the webbed hero. Using gas that can confuse Spider-Man's precognitive senses, hallucinogenic gas, and chemicals that would easily dissolve Spider-Man's webbing, he thought this would be an easy fight to win. He underestimated Spider-Man's power and ingenuity, and was quickly defeated and imprisoned. Quentin would go on to be one of Spider-Man's most persistent and recurring foes. Beck would try many schemes, including working with the Tinkerer and posing as Spider-Man himself, to ruin the hero's image. Early on in his career, Mysterio joined the first iteration of the Sinister Six, under the leadership of Dr. Octopus. But even then, all 6 supervillains proved inferior to Spider-Man's abilities and prowess as a superhero. Time after time, Mysterio would try and defeat Spider-Man, but not once did he ever succeed. The closest he came during this period was when Quentin posed as a psychiatrist, Ludwig Reinhardt, and was nearly able to convince Spider-Man that he was insane, all in an effort to learn the hero's mysterious secret identity. Over time, Beck became sick and developed cancer. As he was dying, he decided to make one last attempt to actually drive a superhero insane, correctly identifying that at the time, Spider-Man was actually Ben Reilly, a clone of Peter Parker, and therefore not his true original enemy for so many years. Mysterio instead chose to focus his plan on Daredevil, a foe he had fought before and he believed vulnerable. He bribed the Kingpin into revealing that the Daredevil was actually Matt Murdock, and from there began an elaborate plan to completely unravel Daredevil's life. As a result of this, Daredevil's former lover Karen Page was killed, and Matt Murdock was badly affected by Mysterio's plans. When the hero confronted the villain, Mysterio wanted Daredevil to outright kill him. But when Matt refused, Quentin instead committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Beck would later return to life in a red version of his suit to confront his successors, claiming to have returned from hell and even possessing a hole in his head where he shot himself. Eventually, he somehow returned to normal and returned to his original iconic suit. During this time period, Mysterio was involved in many schemes, including once again as part of the Sinister Six, and in another confrontation involving Iron Man. He eventually discovered the Ultimate Universe and was able to build an android to help conquer this new world. Together, they invaded this alternate universe, and was only stopped by the 2 versions of Spider-Man from both versions of Earth. Mysterio was taken prisoner in the Ultimate Universe and interrogated for information. Since he knew more from a relatively older Earth, he proved useful in confronting threats such as Galactus, but the experience had some sort of negative effect on his overall health and mental well-being. He returned from the Ultimate Universe and targeted Parker Industries for meddling in his plans, but he was stopped once more by a team of Spider-Man and Deadpool. He was badly injured by Deadpool because of this and escaped from the hospital while recovering. Quentin found this last defeat particularly humiliating, feeling that if someone like Deadpool could take him down, he didn't feel very useful whatsoever as a villain anymore, so the man retired and moved on to Las Vegas. There he was visited by his estranged daughter, a woman named Misty, who he had grown apart from after she had taken an interest in magic and refused to follow in her father's footsteps. She convinced Quentin to follow her into a temple made in honor of the powerful being known as Cyttorak, a being responsible for the powers of the villain known as the Juggernaut. Misty tried to ritualistically murder her father here as part of a gambit to tap directly into the power of the Juggernaut and use this power for herself. She was only stopped by Ben Reilly, who was investigating Quentin to see what the man was up to, and the superhero known as Dusk. Quentin was able to use their intervention to take Misty's knife and stab her instead, accidentally triggering the ritual and empowering Quentin himself. Beck attacked Ben Reilly only for the hero to cut off Quentin's head, breaking the spell and returning Beck back to normal. Dusk took Quentin back to the hospital so the man could get his hand reattached. However, after everyone leaves, it is implied that something is reborn within Misty. As for Quentin, he hasn't been heard from since. Daniel Burkhart was first hired by J. Jonah Jameson to pose as the ghost of the first Mysterio in an effort to trick Spider-Man. At the time, Quentin Beck was faking his own death as a means to get out of prison. This scheme failed and Burkhart was quickly sent to jail for his crimes, where he was abandoned entirely by Jameson as the editor immediately wanted to distance himself from this illegal behavior. Burkhart became resentful of Jameson because of this. When he was freed, Daniel partnered with a cousin of Quentin Beck named Maguire to pose as the Jack-O-Lantern, an old Spider-Man villain. They worked with Norman Osborn to capture Jameson and beat him to a pulp. Given the history between these two, Daniel refused any payment from Osborn for this, saying he was doing this job entirely for the pleasure of taking his revenge on the man who had him imprisoned. Maguire and Daniel worked together as Jack-O-Lantern for a number of jobs, each taking turns as the villain, or, if the job sounded dangerous, using an android in their place. Calling themselves Mad Jack, they worked for a while like this until they were seemingly killed by a bodyguard of Norman Osborn. This was actually a trick planned by both Daniel and Norman himself, and they planned to use this as a cover for an attack on various targets, including Spider-Man, Jameson, and Daredevil. Maguire took on the mantle of Mad Jack, while Daniel returned as Mysterio, and together they attacked these people. They were defeated and Maguire was captured, but Daniel managed to escape. He sold an extra Mysterio costume to another man named Francis Clum, while going on to pose as Mysterio himself for some time after this, and confronting his would-be successor at a later date. A more recent version of Jack-O-Lantern claims to have killed everyone who had worn the mantle of the villain before him, and Burkhart may have been one such villain. However, upon Quentin Beck's return, he was seen working with an assistant named Daniel. Whether or not this is the same Daniel that posed as Mysterio for years is unknown at this time. The third Mysterio was actually born with mutant genes. After Francis Clum's parents were forcibly implanted with mutant genetic code while in a concentration camp during World War II. Francis himself grew up persecuted for being Jewish, and was molested by his brother Garrison, who also had mutant abilities. Clum discovered he had the ability to teleport to telepathically influence others, and limited telekinesis. Garrison forced Clum to use these powers to do a number of criminal things, and the two quickly began to accumulate wealth and build a business empire. The brothers eventually earned the attention of the Black Cat. When confronted by her, Clum was able to forcibly dose this anti-hero with heroin before she could stop them, and Garrison nearly raped her, only to be stopped by Francis, who teleported himself into the space Garrison was occupying, killing his brother in an instant. Black Cat was blamed for this and sent to jail, only for Francis to rescue her. They escaped to the Brooklyn Bridge, and they bonded over their mutual history of sexual abuse. For the first time in his life, Francis felt a connection with another human being. Just as things were going well, Spider-Man arrived, and the shocked superhero was surprised to discover them at the exact same location where Gwen Stacy was killed. With Francis caught off guard, and Spider-Man badly misreading the situation, the hero lost control, beating Francis so badly he left the man with permanent scars. Francis sought revenge for this, so he bought a Mysterio costume from Daniel Burkhart, and learned from the Kingpin how to use some of the villain's old equipment. He attacked Spider-Man after the man publicly revealed his secret identity, assaulting a school Peter Parker was working at during this time period. His plan fell apart when he was confronted by the original Quentin Beck, apparently returned from the dead, with Daniel Burkhart in tow as well. While Beck was mostly amused by the situation, Daniel was eager for a fight and battled Francis outright. Clum nearly won this battle, almost able to successfully use his powers to force Spider-Man into slitting his own throat. But Peter was saved at last minute by his old friend Flash Thompson. Francis escaped this battle but was impaled shortly before doing so, and it is unclear if he survived this event. He has not been seen or heard from since. Another version of Mysterio came to be after an unknown man bought a copy of the villain's suit from a man named Roderick Kingsley. He called himself Mysterion and battled the superior Spider-Man and the Punisher before being defeated and captured. The superior Spider-Man forced Mysterion to work with a number of other captured villains on a team he called the Superior Six. The team eventually escaped, and Mysterion later attacked Liberty Island with an army of robot dinosaurs he built. He was defeated by Squirrel Girl and a number of other superheroes. Across the multiverse, many other versions of Mysterio also exist and are often depicted as foes of Spider-Man. Perhaps the most notable one is a version of Mysterio that managed to trick Wolverine into murdering the X-Men, creating a dark, alternate future where the villains have taken over the world and ravaged the entire planet. It is unclear which version of Mysterio was involved in these crimes on this alternate world, but many fans believe it was Francis Cloom who committed this act in the alternate timeline, which would explain how he was able to influence Wolverine so heavily and add an extra level of irony given Cloom's mutant nature. Another version of Mysterio caused the events of Spider-Man's Shattered Dimensions. After shattering a mystical tablet, he caused problems in the fabric of reality, and was only defeated by the combined efforts of 4 different Spider-Men working across the multiverse. Mysterio will also be depicted in the MCU, where Jake Gyllenhaal will be portraying him as the main villain in the upcoming movie Spider-Man: Far From Home. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my origins and bio for the 3 Mysterios. So when it was announced Mysterio was going to be the main villain of the Spider-Man Homecoming sequel, Far From Home, I was really excited to talk about this character a little more and decided to do an origins and bio for him. And then I found out there were 3 him, so it ended up being an origins and bio for 3 different Mysterios. Really focusing mostly on Quentin Beck, but getting into the other 2 was kind of interesting, and talking about the grander scale of this character is important when we get into stories like Old Man Logan and Shattered Dimensions. Because Mysterio is a really cool character on the whole. He's a classic Spider-Man villain in every sense of the term. Yet another goofy villain in a costume with a bunch of gadgets, who ultimately, unlike Spider-Man, uses his technology and ingenuity for evil rather than for good. Beyond that, there isn't much to the character, at least at first, but he's really fun in just the idea behind him. He's not some magical character, and he hasn't really got any powers until we get into the 3rd iteration of the character. He's just a special effects artist, an illusionist, and that's really fun. Where other characters have actual powers and fantastical abilities, Mysterio is more about just tricking people and doing crazy things along those lines. And for a Spider-Man villain, or any superhero villain really, that's a unique and very fun take on a character. Because of that, he's always kind of been one of my favorites, to the extent that I really surprised myself when I didn't put him as one of the all-time top 10 Spider-Man villains when I made that video. I was thinking back on that, and I can't really tell why. He just didn't really occur to me, and I think he would just be kind of number 12 on my list. So, whatever, but I'm excited to see him in the Spider-Man sequel for this reason. I think he gives the opportunity for a lot of creative takes on the character, and I am just so excited to see what the MCU does with him. As for his real-world history and looking in for recommendations, a lot of the classic Spider-Man stories that feature this character are really Mysterio at his best. Some of the newer stuff is a little more questionable to say the least, even if it only really takes place in an alternate timeline. I'm surprised that the Old Man Logan series never dealt with the Old Man Logan who's returned to the present-day Marvel actually confronting Mysterio. They teased it, but it never seemed to actually happen, unless it occurred way later in the series than I bothered following. But it's not that big a deal. Mysterio's generally at his best anyways when he's with the Sinister Six doing the classic Spider-Man villain shtick. But I do have to say, there is one story that I quite liked that is actually kind of infamous. This is a story by Kevin Smith, And while he's rightfully criticized for the lateness of this story and the sheer amount of time it took for him to complete it, I do enjoy this series. A lot of people don't like it for the way it kind of just throws sexual harassment onto the Black Cat and Spider-Man characters, and it kind of makes Spider-Man into this bad guy in this story. But it's really just coming down to this misunderstanding and the fact that he has all this emotional trauma associated with the Brooklyn Bridge. And I don't know, it's interesting. It colors Black Cat's character in an interesting way. It creates a new version of what would become Mysterio that has this very dark backstory that I found interesting. This was a series I read, enjoyed, and only found out about the critiques a lot of other fans had of this story years after the fact. Because up until then, I had liked it. It was a good story. Certainly not my favorite Spider-Man comic out there, but not one I disliked reading. So when this Clum guy ended up being the third Mysterio, something I didn't actually know about until I went in to do the research of this video, I don't know, I thought that was kind of an interesting take. It's kind of cool that this Spider-Man villain has this history of sexual assault, and it's not the way sexual assault is depicted in a typical setting. He's had a really bleak life, and so there's a lot of sympathy that this guy deserves. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comment section below about all of this, and what you think about Mysterio. A great villain overall. Thanks for watching, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.